And I am thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce to you my friend and colleague, Dr. Dustin J. Byrd. And so, in the words of Dustin, we tend to think of disobedience in a negative light. It's what troublemakers do. However, sometimes leadership demands that we find the courage to disobey, especially when disobedience is in the name of higher principles. Dustin's going to build that idea out for us, and he's going to engage us in a conversation so we can really think about what does that mean for us as courageous leaders and what kind of license does it give us. Dustin, welcome. We are so happy to have you and look forward to a great conversation.
All right. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the invitation to address everybody on this this momentous occasion, on this great event. So, as Kelly said, my name is Dustin J. Byrd. I'm a professor at the University of Olivet. I teach philosophy and religious studies and a whole bunch of other stuff. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is the courage to be free, the ethics of disobedience. So, when one thinks about the great leaders in history, one often finds that they were people who had the courage not only to create great things, to do great things, to overcome and insurmount great obstacles, but they were also people who had the courage to disobey. And disobedience was very much an important thing to many of the most courageous leaders throughout history. Almost so that the courageous leader, we can see it as an archetype throughout history because we recognize it throughout history, no matter what time period in history we're looking at. So take, for example, if we look at the ancient world, the Greek philosopher Socrates would not assimilate to the irrationality of the ruling authorities, even though those ruling authorities were in a democratic system of government. Nevertheless, what he could not do is he could not abide by them. He could not submit to their precepts and to their demands, and he was recalcitrant in his disobedience, and that in and itself was a crime. He was charged with two offenses. One, he offended the gods, and two, he corrupted the youth by teaching them how to think. Spartacus, the great slave rebel there, led one of the largest slave rebellions in the Roman Empire. And he would no longer be a slave, nor would those who he led be a slave. His rebellion was a great way of disobeying the status quo of the Roman Empire. And likewise, Jesus of Nazareth, for instance, his teaching was a political rebellion against the Empire of Rome. Rome was not the kingdom of God, and thus he would not assimilate to its demands. In the late medieval period, we can talk about and think about the Protestant reformer Martin Luther. Martin Luther refused to violate his conscience and thus risked his life for his beliefs. His courageous leadership led to the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation, which was a civilizational sea change in the West. After leading the armies of the Dauphin, Charles VII, Joan of Arc refused to renounce her beliefs in her visions, even while under the threat of torture by the English authorities. In the early modernity, the American founding fathers were people who said no. They were no longer going to obey the authorities, and they revolted against the authorities of England, against the king, and against the parliament. The abolitionists who founded the schools, such as the University of Olivet, and who fought against slavery, and those abolitionists, including William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and the most controversial of them all, John Brown, very much people of disobedience. Of course, the slave rebellions of the United States of Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, large movements of disobedience. In our own period, we can think of a few of the great people who disobeyed, the great leaders, and that is, think about the White Rose. Now, a lot of Americans haven't heard of the White Rose, but the White Rose was Hans and Sophie Scholl and their companions and some of their professors. They were university students at the University of Munich during the Third Reich. They distributed anti-Nazi and anti-war leaflets at their university in 1943, knowing that it was illegal. It wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. They knew they were taking a risk. Nevertheless, they did it. They saw the catastrophe that was coming from this war, the catastrophe that was coming from the Third Reich, and they passed out these leaflets all over their university. Eventually, they were arrested, interrogated, put on trial in front of a judge, Roland Freisler, and found guilty, and they lost their lives. All of these young people lost their lives, but nevertheless, they stand as testaments to history of what it means to have courageous leadership and say no. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Protestant cleric and theologian, he also had to wrestle with this idea of when is it moral, when is it ethically right to say no and engage in tyrannicide. Rosa Parks, in our own history, refused to move from her seat. She simply replied, "My feet hurt," and she wasn't getting up. Now, it wasn't spontaneous. She was trained to do this, but nevertheless, that training came from a conviction that she was no longer going to suffer the consequences of a racist status quo, and she refused to move. And we remember her today. Of course, Dr. Martin Luther King refused to back down despite the relentless attacks on him personally from members in our government, individuals, and groups. And nevertheless, he said no and offered a vision of a better America, a better tomorrow. Even just recently, in the last few years, Colin Kaepernick, the NFL quarterback, who sparked much controversy, he refused to back down. What was his message? It wasn't about the cross or the flag. It wasn't about patriotism. It was about solidarity with people who were dying. It was about Black men who were needlessly being murdered by the hands of police. He was bringing attention to this. And so he refused to be silent in the face of that type of wanton destruction of human life. These and many other nameless and anonymous individuals found the courage to say no. And in saying no, they answered a higher principle, much higher than the one of obedience. Many of them did not survive their disobedience, but did change the world and change their societies. Others survived and likewise changed the world. So why does this word disobedience get such a bad rap? We have to think about this. Now, as children, we are told to obey. We are told to listen to our teachers, our elders, our community leaders, our religious leaders, and our politicians, sometimes on the last ones. We are brought up to believe that obedience is a virtue while disobedience is a vice. We were often punished when we disobeyed, both at school and at home. And for some of us who had mothers who taught in the schools we went to, when we got in trouble at school, we got in trouble at home simultaneously. So we didn't get away with anything. What we inculcated from these experiences is that disobedience is always suspect. Tacitly, we've come to think that those who disobey are only criminals, moral degenerates, and outcasts. These are people who have failed to become well-adjusted to our orderly society. And their disobedience is a sign that they lack proper socialization, moral fortitude, integrity, or what my mother always called good home training. I would like to challenge that notion. Disobedience is a dialectical phenomenon. It contains both within itself a potential to be both positive and negative. It contains within itself both the potential to be progressive and regressive, propulsive and retrograde, emancipatory and domineering. One can engage in disobedience as a rebel, or one can engage in disobedience as a revolutionary. Well, we have to ask, what's the difference? The rebel is pathologically disobedient. Disobedience is the default way of life for the rebel. The pathological contrarian comes to mind. This person, it doesn't really matter what the subject is, they will always take the contrary position, even if it is not what they truly believe. I'm sure many of you have run into the pathologically contrarian. I certainly have myself. For the rebel, disobedience in all things is simply a way of being in the world. In many ways, it is a cry out for recognition and for attention. That's not what we're talking about. For the revolutionary, disobedience is a decision, a moral and ethical decision, one takes in the name of a higher principle. It is not the default setting, but rather the result of discernment, a thorough understanding of the moral and ethical problem that confronts them at that given time within a given context with a given pretext and subtext. In discerning these problems, one must evaluate what the first principle is. What is the first principle that governs this problem? For example, if the moral problem is racism, equality guides the decision to disobey. If the moral problem is injustice, justice guides the decision to disobey. If the moral problem is oppression, freedom guides the decision to disobey. That brings us to the question of freedom. Why do I say the courage to be free? Freedom is not something one is given. Freedom is something that one lives. It's something that one embodies. It's a lived, substantive way of being in the world. The philosopher and psychoanalyst Erich Fromm reminds us that millions of people willfully abandon their freedom to ideologies, leaders, political projects. This happens all the time. This happens in our country, this happens in Europe, this happens in the Middle East, Africa, throughout Asia, all the time. People willfully give up their freedom. That sounds strange. As Americans, we want to think, we want our freedom, we cherish our freedom, we protect our freedom, and yet from a psychological perspective, from a psychoanalytic perspective, you see people abandon their freedom en masse. Why? Because those ideologies, those leaders, those political projects, they give people a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, a sense of security and identity. When they're lacking that purpose, meaning, security, and identity as an individual. To remain free, ontologically free as a human being in ultimate reality, right? It's not just in the political sense, but in the ontological sense. It is a constant struggle to remain free, one that one must find the courage each and every day to preserve. Oftentimes, to remain free often means that we must disobey. Disobey in the political sense, in the economic sense, in the cultural sense, in the ethical and moral sense. But one must always remember, in every instance of disobeying, one is obeying a higher principle. Erich Fromm tells us that there are two forms of authority. There are rational authorities and there are irrational authorities. What's the difference? Rational authority can be found, for example, in the professor-student relationship. We, as professors and our students, have the same goals: the development of the students and the professor's intellect, their character, their ability to discern things, to understand, to analyze things. We have those same goals. Yes, the professor is the authority, and the student submits to that authority knowing that it is rational. It is in their best interest to submit to that rational authority. This submission is not permanent, but rather temporary. As it is meant to bring the student into a condition parallel with the professor's condition. Irrational authority, on the other hand, is the authority that can be found in the master-slave relationship. The master is the ultimate authority, the absolute authority, but that authority is irrational. They do not attempt to develop the slave, to bring them into a better condition, but rather to exploit them. They want to keep them in that inferior condition, right? That inferior condition of servitude in perpetuity. The positive side of the disobedience dialectic is the disobedience to irrational authority. Disobedience to irrational authority is rational. The negative side of the disobedience dialectic is the disobedience to rational authority. Disobedience to rational authority is irrational. While the rebel can't tell the difference, or at least doesn't want to, between rational and irrational authority, the revolutionary follows the disobedience dialectic against irrational authority, while the counter-revolutionary, those escaping their freedom, rebels against rational authority in favor of the irrational. We see the disobedience dialectic time and time again in history, as we saw in many of those examples that I was talking about. It takes courage to be free. It takes courage to say no. It takes courage to disobey the irrational authority. But freedom is dependent on disobedience to the irrational. So what I want to say here for all of us is, let's, as we are now in 2024, we got a lot of challenges ahead of us in our own country, in our own state, and certainly in the world. Let's move the dialectic of history forward boldly, rationally, with the courage to disobey. And we have to think about this. One of the things that Erich Fromm said in his book On Disobedience, he said this. He said, human history began with an act of disobedience. And here he's thinking about Adam and Eve becoming human through disobedience. So history began with the act of disobedience, and it is not unlikely that it will be terminated by an act of obedience. And he was writing that in the context of nuclear war, obedience to the command to launch nukes. Obedience may be the end of the human species. Disobedience might just save us. And with that, take questions.
Dustin, I have a question. I wonder, what are some questions a person can ask themselves to evaluate whether this is an irrational, I'm going to mess up all the terms now. If they are disobeying a rational or irrational force, how do you evaluate whether it's one versus the other?
That's a really good question. We are at a time right now in our own development as a country where that which is rational and that which is irrational is completely blurred. People can't tell the difference. And so people believe in many cases that they're engaged in disobedience towards a irrational authority when they do things like January 6th, the attack on the Capitol. But rational authority is predicated on truth. In truth, as a philosopher, truth is not something that is completely subjective. There is objective truth, even objective truth beyond simple facts. Facts are true, they're there, but there's also a truth that is outside of protocol sentences, if you will. And so one has to really engage in the world. One has to engage in politics and economics in a search for truth. And this is why I as a political philosopher, why I try to stay away from ideology as much as I can. Ideologies are closed semantic universes of certain ideas, principles, ideals that, if taken as dogma, can distort the way we see the world. Because now things that don't fit in our ideologies, we have to distort them so they do fit in our ideologies. And so when you have things like the big lie that came about after the 2020 election, that somehow it was stolen, there was massive voter fraud. And when we see that there's no evidence, no empirical evidence, and it goes from trial after trial after trial, and it's thrown out by 61 of 62 judges as having no evidence. And yet we say, but the person who I trust on the internet, who has no qualifications, right? But somehow I trust them because they attach, I attach them emotionally, or I can invest in them emotionally and they invest in me. He said that this person cheated in the election, therefore I go for it. I mean, that is one of the hardest things we're dealing with right now. Is this very thing. So you have to ask your question, number one, basic, is it true? Is the assertion true, right? If it's not true on an objective standard, one has to reject it and continue to search for truth. How we do that, we're in the realm of psychology at this point, not so much the realm of political philosophy. Psychoanalysis helps us to figure out why people desire to believe in things that aren't true anymore. A lot of that has to do with their needs, psychological needs. Like I said, the sense of safety and security and meaning and purpose and identity. They need that. And the untruths will give those things to them. The untruths have an export. But nevertheless, even if they have a nice export and we like them, we nevertheless have to stick true to truth. And truth is recalcitrant. It is true that racism is wrong. So therefore, I have to say no to it. It is true that misogyny is wrong. So therefore, I have to say no to it. It is true that aggressive warfare is wrong. Therefore, I have to say no to it. And that is a difficult thing to do. And as I showed with a variety of different people in history, a lot of times people lose their lives. Some of the best human beings of disobedience lost their lives in order to disobey. But nevertheless, disobedience is what drives history.
Thank you for that. Lots of good clarity there. We will give folks another minute or two to think about their questions. In the meantime, I would like to let folks know that we have an opportunity through the leadership learning community to continue this conversation if we wish. In our leadership learning community Canvas, I guess we would call it a hub, our Canvas hub, we have discussion forums for every one of the conversations that we've had today. If individuals come up with a question, or if they in the next couple weeks are thinking about something that you've shared, Dustin, I'm going to welcome them to put some, to go ahead and process that in the discussion forum. Certainly you are welcome to go into LDR 900 and check it out, see if anyone is engaging, and if there's anything that I see, I will pass it on to you as well.
Sounds good.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you so much for taking the time to think about this important concept of courageous leadership. You think about it all the time in the work that you do. You see it, you analyze it, and we appreciate that you are willing to invest in helping us understand what that means and how we can live it. And I hope that we will have future opportunities to continue this conversation and others along the same lines. And with that, have a wonderful evening, a great weekend, and look forward to seeing you on campus.
All right, sounds good. And thank you again for inviting me. And at 7 o'clock, the Red Wings are on.
Go Red Wings. Enjoy.